most interesting problems in science today concern the workings of the human mind. Even so apparently simple a process as seeing, for example, involves not only the eye acting as a camera, but the nervous system conveying the picture to the brain, and the brain itself interpreting the picture into the form we finally recognize. We have all seen this process. Let me show you. Experience has shown that objects look smaller when they are farther away. The railroad line appears to recede into the distance. This man looks farther away than this man. Yet we actually know that the picture consists of just a few lines drawn on a flat blackboard. Plainly, the mind has interpreted the picture in terms of our knowledge and experience. In the Horizons of Science film program, we want to look into some of the unsolved problems in science today, to meet some of the people working at them, to see and hear them at work, and to try to share their experiences and their points of view. Today, we will meet a psychologist, Dr. Hadley Cantrell, who is interested in some of the unsolved problems in the field of visual perception. At the Perception Demonstration Center at Princeton University, psychologists are asking questions about how we see. In everyday life, we all believe that what we see is really there. If we didn't believe this, if we couldn't depend on it, we wouldn't be able to get along successfully in life. When we look at this room, for example, we assume that it is like other rooms. It has walls like a room, windows like a room, a floor and a ceiling like a room. It must be a room. Yet, what we see is not always the same as what is actually there. In any normal room, a marble wouldn't run uphill. This is Dr. Hadley Cantrell, director of the Center and former chairman of the Psychology Department of Princeton University. As a psychologist, he has concentrated in the study of perception and behavior. Through a series of scientific demonstrations, he is investigating the way the eye and mind combine to create our world of awareness. Such investigations attempt to probe beyond the physical act of seeing to a better understanding of human experience. For centuries, philosophers and scientists have debated the act of perception. How closely does objective reality correspond with what we see? Dr. Cantrell.
Although you probably noticed that this model room is far from normal shape, it is constructed to appear normal from one point of view. The chin rest and eye patch allow us to see it with one eye from that exact spot where it looks almost perfectly regular. From this position, the bear in the left corner seems smaller than the bear on the right. The walls are straight, the floor seems level, and the windows appear to be all the same size and shape. However, when Malcolm and Jackie look through the back windows, we can see again that something is amiss. Jackie's head seems to be much smaller than Malcolm's. Now when they exchange places, it's Malcolm who seems to have the smaller head. As we go off to one side, however, we see that the room is distorted and the heads become normal. We assume that the room is like nearly all the rooms we are used to, with rectangular walls. And so, in order to keep this assumption, we adjusted objects or people to conform with our fixed idea of the room. And so it is with most of our perceptions. Our assumptions usually work, but they are sometimes wrong. This window, for example, looks like many of the windows of familiar past experience. We quite reasonably assume that this one is similar to them. As the window moves, you will see that it appears to oscillate, to start turning one way, and then turn back, and go the other way. And you will also notice that the mullions of the window that is the cross pieces, vary in thickness as the window oscillates. We are putting a green cover over the window in order to give a clue as to what's really happening. Do you still see the window going back and forth? Or do you now see it going clear around? If you keep looking at one part of the green cover, say one of the lower corners, you will probably see that it is going around in a circle, just as the window is. The oscillating motion is an illusion. What you think you see does not correspond with what is actually happening. Now, what can explain this illusion? Why do you insist that the window moves back and forth? Without realizing it, you have probably made false assumptions about that window. You have probably assumed that it is rectangular, like most all the windows in your experience. But it is not rectangular. One edge is much shorter than the other. Since you assume that the window is rectangular, if one edge looks longer, you interpret it as being closer. But this trapezoid window is so designed that one edge always appears longer than the other. So you refuse to see the long side further away than the short side. Therefore, it oscillates back and forth instead of rotating. Now we have added to the window a short length of tube. Watch what happens to that tube. Some of you will probably notice that the tube seems to cut right through the window. Some others might see that it tends first to elongate and then to bend or wrap around like a snake before it cuts through. The reason for these two different interpretations is that you are making assumptions about that tube without knowing it, whether you see it cut through directly or bend. If you assume that it is an inflexible metal rod, you will most likely see it cut through the window without bending. However, if you assume that the tube is made of flexible rubber, you will probably see it bend before it cuts through. Whichever effect you see depends largely upon your assumptions about that tube, as we have demonstrated by controlled experiments. Now let's see what happens when this red cube is attached to the window. Here again we see something surprising. The cube appears to be moving in a strange way. For most people, it appears to be traveling in a circular orbit clear around the window. Watch this motion carefully. Comes around and oscillates back. The oscillating motion is an illusion. What you think you see does not correspond with what is actually happening. As we can see from above, the window is really rotating, turning completely around on its axis and never changing direction. It is most important to realize that the appearance of oscillation persists even when we intellectually know that the window is rotating. In other words, knowledge alone does not very often alter our perceptions. Now if we look again at the small distorted room, we notice once more that the bears in the corners seem to be different in size. The one on the right appears much larger. As the bears exchange corners, the little bear seems to grow, and the big bear shrinks as Jackie puts him in the left corner. The bear on the left looks smaller because he is twice as far away from us as the bear on the right. We persistently assume that the room is normal and that the two corners are therefore the same distance from us. Because we are unwilling to let go of this basic assumption, we are forced to make the bears grow and shrink as they are moved about in the room. Even when the bears are held side by side, the room behind them confuses our perception, and it is hard to see that they are really exactly alike. Outside of the room, it becomes apparent that the bears are the same size, for here we correctly interpret an apparent change in size as merely changes in the bear's distance from us. In everyday life, this assumption that things look larger when close and smaller when far away is quite accurate. The balloon demonstration begins to show more about the role of our assumptions in the act of perception. If you watch the balloons carefully, I think you'll notice that as one gets closer, the other one goes farther away from you. You see that motion? One coming closer as the other goes away. The reason for this appearance of motion is your assumption that the two balloons are the same size. Therefore, the larger one seems closer to you, and the smaller one farther away. Now, actually, it is only their size that changes. The balloons remain stationary as this apparatus alternately inflates and deflates them. Here again, one balloon seems to come closer as the other moves away. The one that is brighter appears closer to you than the one that is dimmer, for this is the way we most frequently experience things in everyday life. Actually, however, the balloons are still stationary. One is simply getting brighter as the other one gets dimmer. Since size and brightness are interpreted as indications of distance, we can produce an even greater illusion of motion by changing both the size and brightness of the balloons. The perception of motion which you experience here is entirely your own creation due to the assumptions you have brought to this particular situation. The visual illusion persists even when you know intellectually what is really happening. And so it is with most of our assumptions. They are so persistent once established that it is not at all easy to disregard them. Now we'll join Jackie for another one-eyed look at the distorted room and see what can be done about changing basic assumptions and learning new ones. From Jackie's point of view, the room looks normal, although she and we all know intellectually that it is oddly shaped. We'll see how we can learn to recognize the true shape of the room. The object here is to reach out with a pointer and touch a spot on the left corner window. It's a little difficult to reach, for the corner is much farther away than it appears to be. Now we'll try to bring the pointer swiftly across the room to the opposite window where we painted a bug for a target. Our first tries are not very successful, and progress is slow. We keep hitting the back wall because it looks straight, instead of slanting, as it really is. But gradually we can modify and correct our basic assumptions for this unusual situation. Only by acting in the distorted room and acting for a purpose can we see it as it actually is. We recognize its distortion only when we discover that our earlier assumptions don't work. These demonstrations in perception, devised by the late Adelbert Ames, Jr., seem to indicate that we can learn best, can at times only learn, through making mistakes or sharing the mistakes of others. Therefore, mistakes, instead of being things to worry about and to avoid, are really the best opportunities for learning we actually have. Jackie has now learned the shape of the room, but you'll notice she had to make mistakes to do so. Here is a big room of exactly the same proportions as the little room we have just seen. Now instead of teddy bears, we see Jackie and Malcolm changing size. We too are living in a world that's constantly changing. There are constant new adjustments to be made. So it is perfectly normal for all of us to feel frustrated and anxious some of the time. We make assumptions on the basis of our past experiences. These assumptions are essentially bets that we're making, or what a statistician would call probabilities. We make these bets assuming that our past experience applies to our present situations, so that we can carry on our living to achieve some goal. We have shown here the extent to which we ourselves help to create the way in which we see things because of the assumptions we make. But if we are to carry on living effectively, we must rely on these assumptions. Otherwise, we would almost be in a state of paralysis, having to stop and test out everything we see. So we must make certainties out of probabilities. But if we can be aware that this is what we are doing, it may help us to build up better and more reliable assumptions as we constantly act on the basis of faith.
It is quite clear from Dr. Cantrell's work that seeing is more complicated than we might at first suppose. What we see is always influenced by what we take for granted. This is true not only in visual perception, but in all of science. Scientific research is based on careful, patient, accurate observation. And unless we are aware of our assumptions, interpret them correctly, and we may miss the clues that might lead us to a new discovery.